I want to welcome Dr. Gabby. I'm looking at finding you on my screen so I can spotlight you.
Can you see
Thank
me
you so
now?
much for being here. And please, in this room, just to say those of you who are here, and also for you, Dr. Gabby, there is Spanish interpretation in this room. Being aware of speaking clearly and in a way that makes it a little easier on our Spanish interpreters, although they're doing a fabulous job. Thank you.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much. And I'll just share my screen and let me know if you
Please
can't
do.
see it for some reason.
And thanks to Nate Matthews Trigg for connecting us to you.
Oh, definitely. Can you see my slides
We got
okay?
it. Yes, I can. It's great.
Great. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such an important topic, and it's so great that you all are hosting this summit and bringing in so many great people to talk about just the multitude of issues related to extreme heat and health. I'm CJ Gabbe. I'm a faculty member at Santa Clara University, and I kind of happened into heat somewhat accidentally. I was working on a lot of land use and affordable housing issues and got pulled into a team about 8 years ago to try to connect with extreme heat and wildfire hazards. And extreme heat has really caught me as such an important issue. And I've gotten a chance to do a number of different research projects over the last 8 years related to different aspects of vulnerability, planning and policy responses. And then the research I'm going to talk about today is really focused on the needs of people who are unhoused, as well as some of the policy responses. It's been really interesting because there is so much more focus in academic scholarship on thermal inequity for people who are housed, and so there's really a chance for us to push the envelope, I think, and start to create more of an evidence base around things that will seem very intuitive to, I think, everyone here in this Zoom room, thinking about the different types of vulnerabilities that people who are unhoused face related to heat. And this is something that we think will only get worse in the absence of interventions. So I've kind of divided my presentation into two parts. I'm going to aim to go for 20-ish minutes and then give you all a chance for some questions, or 25 minutes and give you all a chance for a couple questions. And I'm happy to connect afterwards with other questions, and I can drop my contact info into the chat too. And I've organized my presentation into kind of being summaries of two different articles that my co-authors, particularly Jamie Chang from UC Berkeley, and I have been working on for the last few years. So our first article is really focused on the idea of thermal inequity for people who are unhoused, and trying to understand what are the lived experiences. And particularly, we're focused on Santa Clara County, California, which is the heart of Silicon Valley. It's also a place where there are at least 10,000, conservatively estimated 10,000 unhoused folks in the county, of whom 77% are living unsheltered in vehicles or encampments. This is from the point in time data, and we think it's probably quite an undercount. And then the second part is after we have been studying the lived experiences, we wanted to focus on what are the types of responses that are occurring from different levels of government, and what are some of the responses from social service providers and other allied groups in the community to reduce vulnerability, trying to take a governance angle on it. So the first part is really based on this article that was published in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction. And let me just talk through a little bit of what we focused on, and how we did it, and then get into the results. So we really wanted to start by understanding what are some of the characteristics of the places where unsheltered people reside, and where are they facing the most heat related exposure, and then how do they describe their experiences with and their adaptation strategies related to heat. So in kind of classic mixed methods form, we tried to break it into two different parts. We first started with more of a descriptive statistical analysis, and mapping and spatial analysis, trying to document what are the characteristics of the places where people are unsheltered live. And then we did 82 different interviews with folks who were currently or recently unhoused to try to understand their lived experiences to heat. And we had a chance to work with social service organization, Downtown Streets Team San Jose, for quite a few of those interviews, as well as some encampment outreach at one of the largest encampments in the area. So as you can see from the map at left, unsheltered homelessness isn't a random occurrence or evenly spread across Santa Clara County. There are certain places in Santa Clara County where unsheltered residents are concentrated, particularly in the city of San Jose, which is the places that are darkest shaded on the map. So we know in downtown San Jose, along the Guadalupe River and the Coyote Creek, these are the most prevalent areas of people who are unhoused. And then we were able to look at some of these areas and look at some of the characteristics, both in terms of temperature-related characteristics and other sociodemographic characteristics. And we were able to say, okay, these areas are about 2% hotter in terms of land surface temperature. They have about 4% less tree canopy. They're lower income, higher poverty, trying to make the case that these areas aren't these are key aspects of thermal inequity that people who are unhoused in the area are experiencing. And then we mapped and did a cluster analysis where we looked at specifically where there are clusters of census tracts where people who are unsheltered intersect with the highest temperatures and least shaded areas. So you can see that there are some clusters south of downtown San Jose. You can see that some of the areas that are least shaded include those clusters that straddle the Guadalupe River and Coyote Creek and near the San Jose airport. So these are some of the areas we were most interested in trying to understand the experiences of local residents. So when we did the 82 interviews, we found a number of things that probably will make a lot of intuitive sense to you all in this Zoom room. So we heard repeatedly that heat was more than just a nuisance. It was something that was distressing. It was affecting every aspect of the respondents' lives. Coping with heat was especially onerous for people who were staying in encampments or vehicles relative to staying in shelters. The folks we talked with had very little access or no access to air conditioning or refrigeration, often limited access to power sources or any type of fans. Finding shade was a constant challenge, and without shade, the residents' tents and vehicles heated really quickly, and they lacked air circulation. And this led to physical health issues and mental health issues. And so some of the symptoms that they described and attributed to heat included dehydration, migraines and headaches, dizziness, fainting, sunburn. They also talked about how it worsened some of their pre-existing physical and mental health issues, made it difficult to keep their medications cool. This was kind of a perfect storm of challenges for the folks we talked with. We also asked because we wanted to understand how people who are unhoused in Santa Clara County chose and what some of the priorities were in the areas that they were staying in, and trying to understand how shade and temperature factored in. And what we learned really was that water and shade were scarce resources, and there was a priority in terms of access to basic services. Basic services and stability were really seen as some of the highest priorities relative to what we might have thought of as kind of the heat specific priorities. And to the interviewees, stability and desirable or acceptable place to stay really was focused on places where they would be least likely to encounter police and neighbors, and the least likely to be, quote, swept or forcibly removed by law enforcement. So, shade was not unimportant, but it wasn't the highest priority for the folks that we interviewed. And you can see this image here is one of the largest, was at the time one of the largest encampments in the area that has since been cleared by and swept by the city of San Jose. So then we wanted to explore the issue of cooling centers, and particularly, we know that it's a central strategy for local governments, and we wanted to ask the participants, did they utilize official cooling centers? If so, what were their experiences like? If not, why didn't they? And the vast majority of participants reported that they don't utilize official cooling centers, and there were a few different reasons that they attributed this to. And we've been using this to try to inform local policies and programs around cooling centers. But the key issues were participants felt they were either not well advertised or conveniently located to where they were staying. There was a perception that the policies at cooling centers, like the hours, policies against intoxication, policies that prohibited pets, or the lack of storage options at the cooling center for their personal belongings were all barriers that made it not worth it to go to the cooling centers. And so instead, interviewees reported trying to go to other air-conditioned buildings that might have more conducive policies, riding public transportation to cool down, or trying to find makeshift personal cooling strategies like finding a power source and plugging in a fan. So from this study, and then I'll go into the governance piece, we found two main things. We found, in addition to the literature on thermal inequity for people who are unhoused, we found that unsheltered, unhoused people also experience thermal inequity in terms of living in areas with hotter temperatures and less shade. So we've been trying to extend the scholarly literature on heat and disadvantage, which is largely focused on housed populations, primarily for data reasons in a lot of ways. And then also that there are these significant and persistent health harms from heat. And meanwhile, despite these health harms, there are also these barriers to finding places that have shade and stability. And so the drivers of locations for unsheltered residents of Santa Clara County were really focused on kind of stability and just access to the most basic services. So that was the first part of our study. And then the second part, building on that, which actually we were excited to hear got accepted by a journal yesterday. So this is actually going to be in press hopefully very soon. I'm happy to share the article once it's published with you all. We wanted to try to understand what are some of the jurisdictional responses if we want to try to inform governance around heat generally and the needs of people who are homeless more specifically. What are some of the responses and barriers today? So we really wanted to start with an inventory of what are the local plans and policies and programs that are intended to mitigate the effects of extreme heat on people who are unhoused. How does collaboration happen between different types of governmental entities and non-governmental entities? And then what are some of the types of obstacles that these entities might encounter, and have they had some successful strategies to overcome these barriers? So what are some of the lessons learned there? So in this study, we did you also used two methods, but took a little bit of a different approach. We started by analyzing what was in the plans of the county government and the largest cities within the county. And so we focused on plans that were either general or comprehensive plans, the hazard mitigation plans, emergency operations and management plans, and the county's homelessness plan. And then we also looked at plans from the Public Transit Agency, Valley Transportation Authority. We looked at plans from the six largest municipalities, including their climate action plans and their general plans. And we wanted to see, okay, what are these plans all saying about heat, first of all? And then secondly, what do they say about people who are unhoused? And then the second piece was because we know from other research that we've done around plants that there's a lot going on often that isn't necessarily codified in a plan, or we may not be able to find written documentation of. So we did a set of 12 interviews and focus groups that included 16 different people from local governments and nonprofit sectors to try to understand what was going on. And just in terms of my own positionality in the project, I at the time was also co-chair of the county's heat and air quality working group. And so I kind of had both the insider and outsider roles in terms of different aspects of some of this project. And so one of our that's kind of one of our opportunities and limitations with this. So getting a little bit into what was in the plans, similar to other studies, quite a few plans do identify extreme heat as an issue, but as we get more specific about who is identified as vulnerable or if unhoused people are identified explicitly as vulnerable, we see fewer and fewer plans that include that. We found that the plans that were most likely to mention unhoused individuals were the emergency management plans and then some of the climate action plans. Only three of the plans included any kind of heat-related maps or data. Most of the plans were much more general in terms of their language, and none included any specific data about unhoused residents' potential heat exposure or vulnerability. Like many jurisdictions, the most prevalent kind of longer term heat mitigation strategies in the plan was really focused on tree shade and the expansion of the urban tree canopy. None of them mentioned it explicitly in terms of people who are unhoused, but these were just general strategies in the plans. And we also found that six of the plans mentioned something about human creating more human created shade. So this could be shade sails or human created shade structures, but none mentioned trying to create human created shorter term shade for people who are unhoused. In terms of the kind of shorter term heat management strategies, we found that cooling centers and early warning systems, particularly through social media and text messaging based systems, were the two most prevalent strategies. And these were mentioned in a number of plans. This is actually very consistent with what we found in other research around California and around the US too. One of the things we noticed was that the county's alert, SCC alert, Santa Clara County system, was really prominently featured in the hazard mitigation plan and the emergency management plan. But most of the local jurisdictions, the city governments, mentioned it very little, or if at all, in their plans. We found very little about heat education, water access, hygiene access, except in the actual countywide homelessness plan. So as we go from some of the more general heat-related provisions to some of the more specific ones, we see fewer and fewer plans have these. And when we get into implementation, and again, this is pretty consistent with what we've seen elsewhere in the US as well, we see less and less specifics in terms of roles for coordination, specific funding, and that includes both general funding or funding specifically for people who are unhoused. So our findings, include a few different things. The key strategies that the county is trying to use include cooling centers and urban warning systems. There's longer term urban heat island reduction planning, but this was seen as having relatively minimal immediate impact on people who are unhoused. And there is quite a bit of street outreach and educational campaign work going on. Most of it just we were finding through the interviews, not necessarily through the actual plan documents. Most of the planning and plans uh, had been referencing some of the shorter term and emergency driven collaboration. And this is something we learned more about through the interviews, particularly in the lead up to heat events. That was when we saw the most communication between different agencies and nonprofits. But there was an increased interest in trying to do year-round coordination and planning to supplement these kind of shorter term emergency focused interventions. And countywide, this heat and air quality resilience working group that I mentioned was seen as something that helped foster information sharing, but didn't really have any specific coordination, didn't have any kind of coordination purview. It was more for creating conversations and moving perhaps some shared initiatives forward.
Please continue.
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. And probably some of the obstacles that we found from talking with some of the respondents will resonate with what you all may be experiencing in New Mexico or beyond. And we found that the experts we talked with and planners and policymakers we talked with talked about budgets that were insufficient to address both long-term homelessness and heat risks, specifically the lack of staff who focused on heat and the existing staff who were working on climate and health issues were juggling multiple responsibilities and really didn't have a lot of bandwidth for heat specifically. There was kind of a lack of centralization, and so there was a perception that there was some duplication of efforts and inefficiency. There weren't any countywide or local metrics to evaluate success. And there was a feeling that some of the rural areas and less populated areas outside of the major cities were getting less attention despite having a problem with heat exposure for people who are housed and unhoused. But on the bright side, there were actually some strategies that seemed to be working. The county and some of the jurisdictions have been successful in getting state and federal grants, and those had been able to fund some heat resilience initiatives. The most impactful one was a CDC grant for countywide heat resilience. There was a move to create more forums for collaborations and conversations, engaging people more around these issues than ever before. And there's also kind of a recognition that there's a lot of scrappy problem solving going on, that many organizations and individuals were really trying to find creative, lower cost ways to address heat risk for people who are unhoused. So, just bringing it together, what are some of the policy implications of these two studies? And the first really was that the most important strategy for reducing heat exposure was really getting people who are unhoused into a housing option. And as we talked with people who were unhoused and people who were on the planning and policy side working on these issues, we heard that in the absence of sufficient housing, that there needed to be safer, cooler places for vehicle parking, other types of camping, and those would really need to include basic necessities like shade, water, access to power, able to support heat management. And cooling centers were a really strategy that had potential, but really needed to be rethought in order to meet the needs of people who are unhoused. So, located near unsheltered residents, rethinking policies, perhaps rethinking the role of nonprofit or unofficial cooling centers. And as an overarching solution, thinking about what would be some kind of sustained funding sources, permanent staffing role like a chief heat officer, how can local elected officials become more dedicated leaders on heat, and also thinking about what would be the metrics to measure success. So there's a lot of work to be done, although we were heartened to see an increased focus on these issues and an openness to learning about what are the specific needs of people who are unhoused. So with that, I'll leave it there and maybe stop sharing and see if folks have any questions, comments. I can, I don't know, Shelley, do you want to, I haven't been able to track the chat too
Sure. First
much.
of all, let's actually somebody raise their hand, Cole Page. So I'm gonna let that person ask
Okay,
the
okay.
question. And then
Hi,
I'll,
my name's Cole. I'm with the New Mexico Department of Health.
Hi.
I had a question regarding the cooling centers actually, because
Yeah.
that is actually one initiative I'm trying to bring up a little bit. I'm currently going to be working with a rural community that New Mexico residents are familiar with it, but it's called Torrance County, and it's very
Hmm.
rural. And one thing I was trying to do is implement cooling centers within the main three cities or towns that they have.
Hmm.
I wanted to see if you possibly had any recommendations or any tips or tricks for kind of getting those implemented, or what steps you would take?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think that's something that we're trying to navigate, but a few things maybe that I would say seem to be emerging as important elements are using places where people already are spending time and kind of turning them into cooling centers. In California, we're calling these resilience hubs, but the idea that they may be associated with faith communities or community,
Mhm.
public, like accessible community centers, kind of going beyond maybe the traditional library model and trying to figure out, okay, where are people spending time and how can we make those places cooler and have some cooling support resources, whether it's access to water, to extra food and snacks, activities for kids, those sorts of things. So I think that that's one key component. And then I don't know how it is in every state, but I know that there's a lot of challenge around kind of this distinction between official and unofficial cooling centers.
Mhm.
And in Santa Clara County, there was real hesitation on the part of the county to advertise any cooling center that wasn't a county-run building. And so it was hard to get the word out around nonprofit community-based organizations that had some kind of cooling center or wanted to have it. And it's interesting because I actually just got back from a research trip a couple weeks ago in Europe around heat adaptation strategies broadly. And one of the things that I was seeing that was almost the other end of the spectrum was some cities that had, and London and Paris are two examples, they had really good interactive maps that included lots of kind of informal community-based organization operated cooling centers and then official cooling centers and maps of drinking fountains, shade. Like they had basically a much broader definition of what the cooling resources are. So I think for, I would say the things that come to mind for your question are really just the idea of thinking about where are the places people spend time, and then also, how can different types of, unofficial or non publicly owned sites be potentially meeting the standards for cooling centers. But I don't think anyone has quite figured it out perfectly yet.
Thank you
No,
so
no
much.
worries. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Really.
thank you for that question.
I'm going to ask Brian's question and then Dr. Chandler yours. Any discussion about solar panels big enough to provide shade below for camps and parking?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing that as a pretty a growing strategy in terms of using shade structures and solar, in parking lots, but in schools, campuses, office buildings. But I haven't seen any examples in this area for using it for people who are unhoused or unsheltered. So I think it's a great suggestion. I will ask around about that, but I don't know the answer. And I'd love to hear if any of you have seen good examples of that we could use perhaps as a case study to share with county officials. So, thank you.
Great. Larry Chandler, Dr. Chandler?
Um, Children, during the summer, we have many homeless or unhoused children. During the school year, they may have some services. But during the summer, which for us in New Mexico, the kids get out of school um, early and have 3 months of extreme heat.
Mhm.
Have you looked at particular or specific programs for children during that particular time?
I haven't, and I think that would be actually a great follow-up study to do. And I think it could connect with some other basic needs for kids during the summer. So yeah, I haven't seen anything specifically on that, but I would love to either connect or I'll kind of add it to our list of things for us to be following up to research, because I think that's a really important point.
Yeah, great. So we have 1 minute left. I'll just say that, and I think just contextualize, this, the risk of fatalities is extremely high. That in Arizona, which has my experience, the best data, California may have as well, but
Mhm.
half of the fatalities were people who are unsheltered, unhoused. And in New Mexico, we don't track that specifically, but I'm sure that people who are at highest risk. We've all are coming back together. Any last comment you want to make, Dr. Gabbe?
No, thank you so much. I'll drop my email in the chat and welcome any follow-up. But yeah, thanks so much. And if you have any trouble finding our articles, just email me and I can just send you a PDF. So thank you for
Please
inviting
do.
me.
People said that your new article's under a paywall, so if you could send that to us, we'll make it available to
Sure.
everybody.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, thanks for inviting me.